In 2024, the world's chocolate supply chain hit a breaking point. Not because people stopped eating chocolate, but because the land that grows it could no longer keep up. More than 60% of the world's cocoa comes from just two countries, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. For decades, the system survived on low prices, underpaid farmers, and the assumption that production would always grow. But in 2024, that assumption collapsed. A perfect storm hit the cocoa belt: severe drought, extreme heat, swollen shoot disease spreading faster than ever, aging farms and lack of new plantings, delays and political uncertainty in Ghana's cocoa sales the result. Output collapsed while demand kept rising. The global market reacted instantly. Cocoa futures surged to their highest levels in more than 40 years. Prices more than doubled within months. In theory, higher prices should mean higher income for farmers. In reality, they didn't, because most farmers in West Africa don't sell at world market prices. For farmers, the 2024 crisis was not a windfall. It was devastation. Many had already lost half their crops to drought. Others were forced to cut down diseased trees. And in Ghana, political and financial delays meant that even farmers with healthy harvests struggled to find buyers. For decades, the cocoa economy relied on one fragile equation: cheap labor plus predictable weather plus unlimited global demand. In 2024, that equation broke. Ghana's sales faced delays. Côte d'Ivoire production plunged. Exporters hesitated. Global chocolate makers panicked. The entire structure, built on underpaid farmers and external pressure, began to crack. But this crisis did not hit a healthy market. Long before the collapse, the cocoa economy showed signs of structural stress. A handful of multinational companies, often called Big Cocoa, control purchasing, logistics, and pricing mechanisms. When the system functioned, farmers earned pennies while corporations captured most of the value. The fundamentals were weakening. The incentives were misaligned. The system was running on borrowed time. Climate pressure accelerated the breakdown, but the underlying fragility was economic. A pricing system tied to international futures markets, but disconnected from farmer realities, a supply chain where the least powerful actors absorbed the most risk, and governments forced to stabilize markets with limited fiscal space. In economic terms, the cocoa sector entered 2024 with high exposure and low resilience. To understand the current crisis, we must understand the logic that shaped the market before it. What happened in 2024 did not appear out of nowhere. It was the consequence of decades of structural imbalance. A system where those who take the greatest risks earn the least rewards. In order to understand where cocoa is heading, we need to understand how it worked before the crisis, before climate shocks, political turbulence, and structural weaknesses collided. The interviews, data, and field reporting you are about to see were recorded before the collapse, but they reveal the economic mechanisms that made the sector so vulnerable: price-setting power, weak bargaining positions, and decades of underinvestment in productivity. This is the cocoa economy before 2024, a system already strained, already imbalanced, and already signaling the crisis that would follow. This is the story of cocoa before the collapse and what it tells us about what must come next.
The chocolate industry is a 100 billion United States dollars industry. And we, who produce 65% of its raw material, cocoa, make less than $6 billion from the toil of our farmers, i.e. barely 6% of the entire value chain of cocoa. The farmers, whose efforts make possible the growth of this lucrative industry, receive merely a pittance for their labors. This is not right. We need to change the statistics. If we simply ground and sold the cocoa in paste form, instead of selling the cocoa beans, we double our earnings.
Yes, we have seen an important change in the way cocoa was processed in the world. 50 years ago, it was really, the post-colonial trade with the South producing the beans and the North processing and consuming the beans.
Farmers are the first and last link in the global cocoa chain. Worldwide, approximately 5 million farmers produce cocoa beans, and they experience the direct impact of world market prices for raw cocoa daily.
There's no way that we can get to a sustainable cocoa sector. The prices are just too low for farmers to really come to a sustainable level. there's lots of politics going on around it, not just within the government, but also within the sector.
The price of cocoa is affected by climate change, the stock market, global events, and the price expectations of major chocolate manufacturers, also known as Big Cocoa.
That's actually the problem in cocoa. Not that there's a lack of money. It's the sector itself is quite wealthy. The big problem is that it's very unequally divided. And a cocoa farmer typically gets around 5 to 7% of the total retail value of a chocolate bar. So most of the margins and the profits are made downstreams.
The chocolate industry still heavily relies on West Africa for the majority of its raw cocoa harvest.
Cocoa is produced mainly in Africa. 75% of cocoa is produced in Africa, and mainly in West and Central Africa.
The origins of chocolate are not in West Africa, but rather in the south of Mexico. The Spanish conquistadors introduced cocoa beans to West Europe in the 16th century, which led to creating the first transcontinental cocoa trade.
In Ghana, for instance, all the cocoa beans belong to the government. All the cocoa beans. So to have an aircraft maker is not so easy. There are many chocolate makers there, but the beans belong to the government. In Ivory Coast, the beans belong to you.
Around 3 million tons of raw cocoa are produced each year. The Côte d'Ivoire is the largest producer in the world, followed by Ghana in second place. Côte d'Ivoire also processes 50% of its own harvest.
And nowadays, we see about half of the entire world production being processed in cocoa-producing countries. The largest countries where the beans are ground, are processed and transformed into cocoa mass or cocoa liquor, cocoa powder and cocoa butter are Côte d'Ivoire with about 800,000 tons of grindings, and Indonesia with about 500,000 tons of grindings.
Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire rely on the supply of semi-finished cocoa products, which fetch higher prices than raw cocoa beans and could therefore double their export revenues. By preventing the construction of new plantations, they are also limiting the supply of cocoa for export.
In the two biggest cocoa producing countries, in Ghana and in Côte d'Ivoire, the price is determined by the government, but that government determines the price based on the world market price. So indirectly, it still is the world market price that determines what the farmer gets.
Process locally will be a solution. To process locally, we will increase some jobs, but we can process a part of the way locally and sell it in Europe, like cocoa powder, other things. They can use it to make a chocolate. It's not so bad.
The government of Côte d'Ivoire has pursued an intensive policy to make processing cocoa locally more attractive, offering tax breaks and other incentives to Ivorian companies.
A couple of million smaller farmers produce that cocoa. And then at the other end of the value chain are a couple of billion of consumers that like chocolate. And in between, there's literally two hands full, around 10 very big companies, 4 big processors of cocoa, processors and traders, and around 6 global brands or houses of brands that control most of the chocolate.
If we look at Côte d'Ivoire, about 40% of the 2 million tons produced in the country are processed locally. So the exportations are not exportation of beans exclusively anymore, but are exportations of butter, powder, liquor, and other semi-finished products.
6 companies share 40% of the world's total chocolate production. In the USA, Mars, Hershey's, and Mondelez. In Switzerland, Nestlé, Sprungli Lindt, and in Luxembourg, Ferrero. And only 4 companies buy and use 65% of the global cocoa output.
Yeah, so I don't know the per capita consumption, but in total around 4.5 billion tons of cocoa are produced every year. And that's mostly consumed in Europe and the US in the form of chocolate or chocolatey products, like in bakery or in drinks, of course. But most of it in chocolate. And Europe and the US are still the biggest markets.
Mars, Mondelez, and Hershey's Company are the world's 3 biggest candy companies. Mars Wrigley Confectionery alone made $22 billion in sales in 2023. The European Union accounts for 92% of the world's cocoa exports and 80% of its imports. The Netherlands, home to one of the world's largest cocoa grinders, is the world's largest importer of cocoa beans. Côte d'Ivoire is the Netherlands' main supplier. The value of the Netherlands' cocoa imports is almost 1.57 billion euros.
Those markets are saturated with a very high level of chocolate consumption, between 5 and 10 kilos per capita per year. But you know that the demography in Europe and the States is quite flat, so the market is not expanding in terms of consumption.
Around 1 million people work in cocoa farming in Côte d'Ivoire, with 20% of the population depending on the cocoa industry. Cocoa is the main source of foreign exchange, accounting for 15% of the country's gross domestic product and about 40% of its exports in 2022.
The current market price is obviously way too low, and that's causing enormous problems and leads to human rights violations.
According to the World Economic Forum, cocoa farmers in West Africa earn an average less than $2 a day, which is below the living wage in both countries. In Côte d'Ivoire, the living wage is $237 per month, and in Ghana, it is $359.92 per month.
So companies can and should negotiate a different price with their suppliers, a price that's at least the living income reference price. In the way we look at an inherent stabilization in how we buy cocoa, because when the market is down and then the cocoa price is low, the farmgate price is low, but then the gap to the living income price is high. So then we pay, based on the lower cocoa price, a bit less, but then we pay more premiums to fill that gap.
Belgium is Europe's largest exporter of cocoa beans, and it's home to the world's largest chocolate factory, Barry Callebaut AG. Between 2021 and 2022, the company generated sales of more than 8.2 billion euros or $8.7 billion.
The way the world market price is determined is really complex, and there's a lot of different variables. But in the end, they get determined in something called the terminal markets. And there's two commodity exchanges, one in London, one in New York.
In cocoa trading, there is a distinction between the local market and the global commodity futures exchanges. The two largest commodity futures exchanges are the ICE Futures Europe in London and the Coffee, Sugar and Cocoa Exchanges Inc. of New York, where these companies purchase the planned allotment of cocoa beans for the year in advance before the farmers have even planted the crop.
The state, the government is a middleman, but the biggest middleman is the trader and the other thing, the big company. They support many things to make it, but they cannot change the price. It's more. The price cannot be changed because it is in New York. It is in the trader in London. They make this. For instance, 80% of the world harvest of next year is already sold.
And there's traders that look at supply and demand, and every day that supply and demand determines kind of what the world market price does at that moment. And then that world market price then trickles down to determine what the price is that the cocoa farmer gets. But that is also differing per country. So in most countries, the farmer will get the world market price or something close to that.
But probably the crux of the matter is the international price, because no one is fixing the price of cocoa at international level. And in particular, the two stock exchange, or rather commodity exchange of London and New York, where you have the global supply and the global demand meeting.
Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire are heavily dependent on the cocoa market.
The current market is quite high, actually, but it also goes up and down all the time, and that's actually what the issue is, because this fluctuating market price is something that companies can manage quite well, so they can work with the terminal market to hedge their pricing risks, but farmers cannot. They don't have access to any hedging tools or risk mitigation tools. So basically they are price takers.
But chocolate companies are not affected by cocoa price fluctuations.
Actually, all the price of the goodies in Europe, I come from next every 2 weeks I was in Paris. All the price of the little thing are increased, is everywhere the same thing. But here the price of cocoa, the farmer decrease. I say, even the chocolate, the cocoa powder in Paris, for the distributor, all the price are increased. They say it's Ukraine war, they say many things, all are increase the price. But in Africa, the farmer continue to obtain €1 per kg. For me, is a big, very absurdity.
The headquarters of the International Cocoa Organization is located in Abidjan, the economic capital of Côte d'Ivoire.
The ICCO is an intergovernmental organization. It's not, legally speaking, a UN agency, but it's a UN-based international organization. Our members are countries from both sides of the value chain. So we have producing countries that we call exporting countries. They are exporting beans. And we have importing countries or consuming countries. Producing members represent 95% of the world production.
Since 1973, ICO has aimed to reduce global cocoa price volatility.
The first aspect of our mandate is to bring transparency into the sector by providing statistics. The second aspect is to offer a platform of cooperation and policy dialogue among our members and between the producing and the consuming countries.
As an economic policy institution, ICO aims to address the well-known problem of the cocoa supply chain through a dialogue with the various stakeholders in the cocoa sector.
In a nutshell, I would say the three most important points and topics that are constantly discussed are the level of price and the living income of the farmers. Second, the questions of adaptation, mitigation of climate change with a special emphasis on deforestation. And in social matters, child labor and the level of wages for the workers in the cocoa sector.
A lot of children are involved, particularly in West Africa, doing labor that is dangerous for them, labor that is not appropriate for their age, or instead of being able to go to school. So this is all we call child labor, and there's more than 1.5 million children working in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana alone, doing work they shouldn't be doing.
1.5 million children work illegally in cocoa. So that's a bedazzling amount. To put that in human perspectives, it means that in an average cocoa community, almost 1 in every 2 children work illegally.
Researching the use of child labor, particularly forced child labor and trafficked children harvesting cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire in the late 1990s.
There are many illegal cocoa plantations in Côte d'Ivoire. As a result, large areas of rainforest continue to be cleared. These plantations often employ children. Terry Collingsworth, a human rights lawyer, has been fighting against child labor in Côte d'Ivoire for over 20 years.
And since then, I've been working on this issue, trying to get the major chocolate companies to stop their practice of profiting from enslaved children. Initially, we focused our efforts on Nestle and an American agricultural conglomerate called Cargill, which is probably the biggest player in the cocoa sphere.
Cargill is the largest cocoa company in the world and the largest privately held company in the US.
They sell cocoa to all of the big brands. That was our initial focus because we were able to identify their supply chains a little bit easier because they had a very visible presence in Côte d'Ivoire. But since then, we have expanded our attention, and our current pending lawsuit on behalf of 8 formerly trafficked and enslaved child workers is against Nestle, Cargill, Barry Callebaut, Mars, Hershey, Mondelez, and Olam. Those big players are all equally responsible for the practices of using child labor to harvest cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire and also Ghana.
Despite his efforts, Terry Collingsworth has not yet succeeded in any of the legal proceedings for the child labor lawsuits he has brought against the big chocolate manufacturers.
So over 22 years ago, after we presented our evidence to our Congress of all of the trafficked and forced and child labor harvesting cocoa, our Congress was on the verge of passing a law that would have regulated the industry and required the companies to establish that they were not using child labor in their cocoa if they were to import it into the United States. The companies instead hired lobbyists and derailed that process and came up with something called a voluntary initiative. It was called the Harkin-Engel Protocol.
Despite the adoption of the Harkin-Engel Protocol in 2001, child labor has instead increased over the last 14 years. 8 companies signed the protocol, including Nestlé, Mars Inc., Hershey's Food Corporation, Barry Callebaut, Guittard Chocolate Company, World's Finest Chocolate, Blommer Chocolate Company, and Archer Daniels Midland Company.
And all these big companies signed it and promised to stop using child labor by the year 2005. Since then, the only thing they've really done is given themselves extensions of time. The current deadline they've given themselves is 2025, and several of them are now saying it'll be 2030, and I predict it'll be never.
The Harkin-Engel Protocol contains a loophole stating that participation was voluntary.
That the main barrier to that is simple corruption. I have my own stories of seeing police officers look the other way when trafficking is going on, but by all accounts, government officials at the highest level in both countries are on the take and getting paid to do nothing about this problem. There are lots of children from Mali and Burkina Faso who are captured or kidnapped by labor brokers that promise them a high-paying job in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana harvesting cocoa. And then when the kids get there, they are told that they're going to work for free and food. And typically what happens is they arrive with a labor broker who sells them to farmers, and then they are in the middle of nowhere on a cocoa plantation. They speak a different dialect. They have no documentation, no papers, no passport, and they don't have a penny in their pocket.
So nothing wrong with making a profit. What is wrong is maximizing your profit at the expense of human rights violations and environmental destruction at the beginning of the supply chain. So that is actually what we are showing to the world, that it doesn't need to be like that. So you can still be a very successful, fast-growing commercial organization, a company that makes a profit, but not maximize your profit.
The degree of control that Big Cocoa has over the value chain is evident in the pricing of European chocolate bars. Of the total revenue, 44% goes to retailers, 35% to manufacturers, 8% to grinding and processing, 4% to taxes and marketing costs, and 2% to transport and trading costs. A mere 7% is allocated to the cocoa farmers.
People are referring to prices without clarifying which prices we are talking about. The farm gate price, so the price paid to the farmer at the level of the plantation, is not the price paid by the importers to the exporters, and it's not the price paid by the final consumer. So I'm just mentioning those 3 prices: farm gate, exporter, and consumer price, but they are completely different.
In 2020, the Ivorian president, Alassane Ouattara, urged major players to pay fair prices.
Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire have relatively similar systems, but they are still quite different. They are both setting a price for cocoa. They do fix a price at a roughly same level. I'm saying roughly because they do not have the same currency, and sometimes the conversion rates may have an impact on the real value of the farm gate price expressed in CFA franc in Côte d'Ivoire or in CEDI in Ghana. But all in all, the price is set by the government. The difference between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire is that in Ghana, the government, through the Ghanaian Cocoa Board, is really holding the market by having the monopoly of buying and selling cocoa.
A fixed minimum price, known as the lid, was introduced in 2019. Since then, the price of raw cocoa has remained at around 70% of the export price.
This is something called the living income differential. The first year it worked quite well, and then from then on it started working a lot less well for a whole bunch of technical reasons.
Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire both set the lid from the top down through the cocoa board, but the Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire governments set their prices using very different systems and regulations.
So it's a state-owned agency, Ghana Cocoa Board, that is in charge of buying beans and selling beans, even though they use licensed buyers to buy and they use a separate entity, the cocoa marketing company, to sell. But they are really managing the sector directly through the state agency. Whereas in Côte d'Ivoire, we have a partially liberalized system where the government does set the price, but the private companies do buy and sell and export. The Ivorian Cocoa Board, that is called CCC, Conseil du Café Cacao, they still have a strong influence on the exportations because they do authorize the traders to export if they meet some requirements, including a certain level of price. In Ghana, it's direct control. In Côte d'Ivoire, it's indirect control. Now, in many other countries, it's the free market.
Only Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire set and regulate the prices of cocoa through their governments, unlike the other cocoa-producing countries in the rest of the world.
There is no Nigerian or Cameroon cocoa board, and they do issue indicative price, but the market does fix the price at the end. The same in Latin America or the same in Asia.
Despite the introduction of lid, the minimum price has not risen enough to guarantee a living wage for farmers.
I think publicly all companies committed to paying the LID, and they do, but then they also found ways to evade the consequences of it by negotiating down a different part of the price or by trying to source part of their volume from different origins.
There is a lack of transparency regarding the payment process, as there is a significant disparity between the surcharge of 400 per ton and the actual amount received by farmers, particularly considering the exchange rate.
But then prices went down because the economic activities was slowed down during COVID, and then they refused not to pay the lid, but to pay other premium, in particular the country of origin premium. So they were paying the lid, but not paying another premium. So this being compensated by that, the result was not a zero increase of the price.
Media reports state that the Hershey's company, an American chocolate tycoon, purchased 30,000 tons of cocoa through the American Futures Exchange ICE to avoid paying the lid. Typically, companies buy cocoa directly from the source. However, purchasing the product on the secondary market via an exchange exempts them from paying the premium.
So publicly, everybody said, no, yes, we're going to pay that LID. But in reality, you see that a different part of the international cocoa price was then negotiated down. So the net effect is zero. So unfortunately, that attempt didn't work that well for cocoa farmers.
Most chocolate companies have a large budget to pay reasonable prices and spread the wealth further down the supply chain. For example, Hershey's generates annual net sales of over $10 billion worldwide and made until end of 2022 a profit margin of 17%. Hershey's annual gross profit for 2023 was $4.99 billion. So, for a company like Hershey's, there is room to ensure that the prices paid are fair and that the benefits are shared throughout the supply chain.
If you care about the farmer being poor, it's not rocket science. The first thing you could do is give them more money. It's not that tricky. And that's the first thing companies could do.
Only 20% of cocoa farmers worldwide are organized in cooperatives.
We need to see quite a few different changes happening at the world market. It would be great if at the producer government level, there would be more policies around supply management and rural development.
The government is encouraging West African farmers to diversify their crops. Many are turning to rubber production.
I'm really positive about human rights and environmental due diligence legislation that is coming up. But if you really want to change the norm, then you also need legislation to push up the floor, not just raise the bar. And I think this is what this legislation will do.
In late 2022, European Union member states reached a consensus on a Europe-wide supply chain directive. This directive mandates that large companies adhere to human rights and environmental standards throughout their entire supply chain. The law applies to all European companies with 250 or more employees and a global turnover of more than 150 million euros. The supply chain for cocoa is complex and it's influenced by a few factors. It can be divided into two main parts: cocoa processing and chocolate production.
One can say that if you look at the value chain, so the successive chain of transactions between the farmer and the final consumer, you have a long chain of transactions with a lot of stakeholders. Between the farm and the port of exportation, you can have 4 or 5 transactions. Between the exporter and what we call the grinder. The grinder is the big company processing the beans into cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, cocoa powder. You can have another number, 2 or 3 transactions. And then between the grinder and the brand, the chocolate maker, you can have 1 or 2 or 3 transactions. And then the brand, the chocolate maker, is going through a distributor, and the distributor is going through a retailer for finally reaching the consumer. So you have a lot of transactions, and that is very costly, actually.
So basically, this new law, the CSDDD, is a tool by the European Union to get companies, not just in chocolate, but in lots of different supply chains, to say, we know where our problems are, we're working on our problems, we know that what we're doing is working, and when it's not working, we're going to improve it so that it does work.
The EU has adopted a regulation on deforestation, imposing to the importers, those who are putting beans or cocoa transformed products into the European market for the consumption of European consumers, they have imposed some obligations of due diligence to make sure that this cocoa being imported in Europe was not a product resulting from the deforestation in the countries of origin. And they have imposed some obligation, not only of due diligence, but also of traceability and information.
However, this legislation only applies to living wages and not to living incomes. This means that self-employed farmers who determine their income through prices and production levels are not protected by supply chain law.
I have made a chocolate bar with great traceability before COVID-19. A chocolate bar, when you can geolocalize on Google Earth all the process of this chocolate bar. You can localize the farming, the farm of the cocoa plantation. You can also have more information of farmer, on his family, his contact, with the great traceability, and the women that roasted the bean, all the things on a QR code, you can find it.
Currently, companies can approach traceability in various ways. Some rely on figures from standardization organizations and cooperatives, while others use GPS tracking and polygon mapping. All of this information can be tracked with a QR code.
At the moment, the USA is not doing very much at all, for a whole bunch of reasons, but there's not been a lot of developments in America for quite a while now.
The United States has had a law on the books since 1930 called the Tariff Act of 1930. and it prohibits the importation of any product, including chocolate, that is made with forced labor, in whole or in part. And I filed a petition more than 3 years ago, asking the U.S. Customs and Border Protection to ban the importation of chocolate coming in from Côte d'Ivoire by these named companies that are using forced child labor. The petition has just been sitting there unenforced all of this time. And I think that's because the big companies put pressure on our government to not shut down their cheap pipeline to chocolate in Côte d'Ivoire. So the government has done nothing.
Despite many efforts like the new supply chain laws, West Africa still faces challenges in achieving fair prices and sustainable production under humane working conditions.
I don't think that anybody has the individual power to solve all the problems. And so the governments need the companies, and the companies need the governments, and everybody needs the farmer, and the farmer needs everybody.
The cocoa sector is a complex and controversial market that reflects the social and environmental challenges of our time and is still coming to terms with its colonial past.
So I think that's the greatest danger, that these companies have a lot of political clout. They have a lot of money to throw around, to make donations to politicians, and that they will do everything they can to preserve this system. And I have to emphasize that I sued Nestle and Cargill in 2006, and they fought me for 16 years in court until the Supreme Court, on a technicality here, dismissed the case.
Since the early 2010s, the chocolate industry has been warning of production bottlenecks in the future as most plantations are aging and suffering the effects of deforestation. This is compounded by worsening climate change, which is affecting crops by creating too much or too little rain.
Indeed, it is disturbing the climate. Indeed, there are less rains in the rainy season and more rains in the dry season. Indeed, some areas are becoming too hot or too rainy, too humid to produce cocoa, but it also gives the possibility to new areas to produce cocoa. So you can have the places of production will move around probably in the northern direction.
Since 2019, cocoa growing regions in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana have lost almost 60,000 hectares of tropical forest. This is equivalent to an area the size of the Spanish capital Madrid. Recent data from Côte d'Ivoire shows that an area almost the size of Rwanda has been replaced by cocoa plantations. At the University of Applied Science in Zurich, scientists are developing artificial chocolate. But what about West Africa? Is this really the answer to sustainable and fair chocolate?
The governments need to get control of this industry and make it something that has a future and that is not devastating both the environment, but also their economies by making their farmers basically indentured servants.
Leading companies like Nestle and Hershey's, as well as powerful governments in the United States of America, Germany, and the Netherlands, have a great responsibility to improve conditions for cocoa farmers due to their high market concentration in the chocolate sector.
But governments could also put in place policies that look at how do we develop our rural areas? How do we kind of invest in the cocoa, or how do we invest in other crops, or how do we invest in services rather than in agriculture? There's a lot of different ways that you can do supply management. The amount of possibilities are about as broad as any government has policy measures to their disposal.
That really is when the governments of Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana have to stop, the government officials have to stop being selfish and thinking of their own financial gains and think about the long-term benefits to the country. And the industry needs to be modernized for sure. Step number one is that the farmers need to be paid a whole lot more than they're getting for the chocolate. That's what made Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana attractive, is that the governments were willing to allow the companies to pay a very low price and basically starve out the farmers in the first place and require them to do things like recruit child workers.
If you don't have rules, power will actually exploit, always. We need rules to actually hold power accountable. And even a country like the United States that doesn't like rules has got a minimum wage for its employees. You know, if you've got countries that are as liberal and as free market as that, putting in place minimum wages, we should be able to do that for global agriculture as well.
To provide a living income for cocoa farmers, several systemic changes must happen at once. More sustainable agricultural practices must be adopted, fair trade conditions must be negotiated throughout the supply chain, and governments both in the West and in Africa must enforce humane policies such as anti-child labor and trafficking laws and a minimum wage for farmers.